and the first thing that happens, usually, is the love scene.
She was the embodiment of grace, dignity, and class. Julie Andrews, the voice that gave life to Mary Poppins and the heart that carried the sound of music, has long been one of Hollywood's most cherished icons. For decades, she remained carefully guarded, always proper, always poised. But now, at 90 years old, Julie Andrews is finally letting go of the secrets she held closest to her heart. In a quiet, candid moment that's taken fans and former colleagues by surprise, Andrews revealed a playful, deeply human side the world never truly knew. And what she shared, it left even those closest to her stunned, because this wasn't about awards, about regrets, or even about aging. It was about desire, about honesty, about the 7 men she says she fantasized about, admired, and, yes, even wanted to sleep with. In an industry obsessed with scandal, Julie's revelation isn't tawdry. It's tender, vulnerable, and laced with a kind of honesty we rarely see from a star of her stature. And the names? Some are predictable, others shockingly unexpected. But each tells a story, not just about attraction, but about what it meant to be a woman in the golden age of Hollywood, longing in silence while playing perfection on screen. So who were these 7 men? Why did she never act on it, until now when it no longer matters? And what does this surprising confession reveal about the secret emotional life of Julie Andrews? Stay with us as we uncover the list no one saw coming, from a woman who, for nearly a century, kept the most intimate part of herself hidden behind a smile. When Julie Andrews first stepped into the world's imagination, she did so as a vision of purity, from the high, clear notes of Mary Poppins to the soft strength of Maria in The Sound of Music. She became the epitome of the ideal woman, gentle, graceful, untouchable. But while the world saw a flawless governess dancing across alpine meadows, inside her beat the heart of a woman with dreams, desires, and fantasies she never dared speak aloud. Raised in post-war Britain, Julie's early life was built on discipline and propriety. Her mother, a pianist, and her stepfather, a violent alcoholic, provided a home life that was as unstable as it was emotionally repressed. Julie's singing voice, discovered young and trained to perfection, became her salvation. But even as she rose to fame on the West End stage, touring as a child prodigy, there was little room for feelings, and certainly none for lust. Behind her delicate posture and charming smile, Julie was growing into a woman who noticed the way men looked at her, and the way she looked back. But in the 1950s, actresses were expected to play sweet, not sensual. Virginity was a virtue, and any hint of sexuality had to be painted with innocence. And Julie, ever the professional, buried her thoughts under layers of politeness. She was taught to be appropriate, but no amount of proper upbringing could stop the curiosity. And in hushed moments behind dressing room doors or quiet evenings on studio sets, she couldn't help but wonder about the men she worked beside, their scent, their smiles, the way they moved when they weren't in character. She wouldn't dare act on it, not then, but the thoughts were always there, lingering just beneath the surface. As she transitioned into Hollywood royalty, the temptation only grew. Leading men with swagger and raw magnetism surrounded her. Cary Grant, with his old-school charm. Marlon Brando, wild and rebellious. Rock Hudson, so warm and gallant. Each one a symbol of something she was taught to admire, but never touch. She joked, blushed, deflected, but privately she watched. She dreamed, not like a seductress, but like a woman yearning to be seen as more than a soprano. Because by the time she reached international superstardom, Julie Andrews had spent decades being defined by what she wasn't. She wasn't sexy. She wasn't scandalous. She wasn't dangerous. She was safe, wholesome, family-friendly. But that image, immortalized in song and snow globes, became its own kind of prison. Beneath the prim exterior, Julie craved connection, physical, emotional, passionate. Not because she wanted to be provocative, but because she was human. She once said in an interview that it was hard being seen as perfect all the time. The world didn't allow her room to be flawed, to want, to feel in ways that couldn't be put to music. And so she kept her list to herself, those few select men who stirred something deeper than admiration. She never whispered their names in public, never let the press near those feelings. But as time passed, and the weight of performance faded, she finally allowed herself to speak the truth. Not as a scandal, but as a release, a quiet, cheeky confession from a woman who had finally stopped caring what the world expected of her. And at 90, with no image left to protect, Julie Andrews began to unbutton the story she kept closest to her heart. Not because it would shock anyone, but because she finally could. For most of her career, Julie Andrews played characters who were admired, but never desired, cherished, but never chased. But behind the scenes, far from the expectations of studios and audiences, her heart stirred quietly for a handful of men whose presence haunted her long after the cameras stopped rolling. Now, as she reflects on her life at 90, she does so not with shame or regret, but with a hint of a smile and the freedom of someone who no longer has to hold anything back. In a private conversation with a close friend, Julie finally whispered the names that once lived only in fantasy, and they weren't just pretty faces. They were men who stirred her in ways she never dared to admit, while still bound by the golden rules of the silver screen. The first name? Cary Grant. Of course it was Cary. With his tailored suits, effortless charm, and voice like silk, he was every woman's secret dream, and Julie was no exception. She met him at industry events in the 1960s, and though they never worked together, the way he looked at her, with amused curiosity and gentle flirtation, left her flushed for days. He was a gentleman, too polished to make a move. But Julie would later admit that it was precisely his restraint that made her imagine what might happen behind closed doors, if the rules were different, if she wasn't Mary Poppins in every man's eyes. It wasn't about love. It wasn't even about romance. It was about the quiet ache of being wanted as a woman, not just adored as an icon. Next came James Garner, her co-star in Victor Victoria. A man's man with a disarming grin and the kind of natural masculinity that didn't need to announce itself. On set, they had chemistry, subtle, professional, but unmistakably real. Julie would later confess that during filming she often found herself watching Garner between takes, marveling at his gentle strength. He was kind, grounded, funny, and utterly unaware of how attractive he was. Their relationship remained respectful, even platonic, but in the privacy of her mind. He lived in a different version of that story, one filled with stolen kisses and what-ifs. And then there was Rock Hudson, perhaps the most bittersweet name on her list. Rock was her close friend, her trusted confidant, a man who made her laugh until she cried and who held her hand through difficult times. Julie always knew that Rock would never return her affection in the way she quietly dreamed of, but that didn't stop her from imagining it. She spoke about him with deep tenderness, once calling him the most beautiful man I've ever known. Their connection was emotional, almost spiritual, but beneath it all, she still ached for the fantasy she knew would never be real. That aching didn't come from naivety. It came from love, admiration, and the desire to be desired by someone she adored so completely. It was a longing that never turned bitter, only quietly folded into her heart like a secret letter never mailed. These men, Grant, Garner, Hudson, represent not just the allure of old Hollywood, but something deeper. The permission Julie never gave herself to be a woman who could want, boldly and unapologetically. In her youth, she kept those feelings buried beneath ball gowns and Broadway tunes. But now, at 90, they've become treasured memories, fantasies once locked away, now offered freely, without shame, as proof that behind the world's most graceful actress lived a woman full of passion, curiosity and desire, and there were more names on that list. 4 more, in fact, each one tied to a moment, a memory, a glance that lingered too long. And for the first time, Julie Andrews was ready to reveal them all. By the time Julie Andrews reached the peak of her career, she was no longer just a star. She was a standard, a symbol of elegance, a benchmark of morality in an industry that was anything but. And yet behind that polished image was a woman very much alive with feeling. The final 4 names on her list weren't simply about attraction. They represented moments of electricity in a life that demanded restraint. The 4th name, one that surprised even those closest to her, was Paul Newman. Julie met him only a handful of times at charity galas and industry dinners. But she remembered everything, the way his eyes seemed to see right through her, the casual way he leaned in to speak, and how his humility made him all the more magnetic. "He made you feel like the only person in the room," she once confessed. There was never anything flirtatious between them. Not publicly. But in her mind, Newman wasn't just a good man. He was temptation wrapped in sincerity, and in another life, she would have loved to have gotten lost in him. The fifth name was one that had hovered in her memory for decades: Sean Connery. Rugged, dangerous, unapologetically masculine. To Julie, he was the very definition of everything she was supposed to avoid. And maybe that's why he lingered so vividly in her imagination. She described once catching a glimpse of him backstage at an award show, a glass of scotch in hand, shirt slightly unbuttoned, and for a moment, her breath caught. There was no interaction, no introduction, just a look, one that burned into her memory. "He was never mine," she would later say with a grin, "but I enjoyed the idea of him." Then came Omar Sharif, the exotic and impossibly romantic star of Dr. Zhivago. Their paths crossed during a brief award season campaign in the late 60s. They chatted at length at a dinner party, their conversation flowing between music, travel, and politics. "He had a voice like velvet," she recalled, "and the most beautiful hands." There was something intoxicating about him, something untamed, and Julie, so often measured and precise, found herself secretly hoping the night would never end. Though nothing ever happened between them, she admitted much later that Sharif represented the kind of passion she never let herself pursue. He was the one who might have taken her heart if she'd ever dared give it away outside of the safe. Scripted love stories she acted out on screen. And finally, the seventh name, the one that surprised even her as she spoke it aloud after decades of keeping it tucked away, was Dudley Moore. Not the heartthrob, not the classic leading man, but funny, brilliant, irreverent Dudley. They became close friends in the 1980s during overlapping projects in Hollywood. And though he often made her laugh until she wept, Julie admitted there was a time when she felt more. "He saw through me," she once shared in a quiet moment. Not as the icon or the voice or the actress, just me. There was no grand romance, no whispered flirtation. But there was an emotional closeness that Julie privately admitted had all the makings of something more, if either of us had been brave enough to let it. Dudley, to her, was the road not taken, the missed moment, the friendship laced with unspoken longing. These 7 men, Grant, Garner, Hudson, Newman, Connery, Sharif, Moore were never trophies, never conquests. They were windows into the woman Julie Andrews quietly was all along. A woman with dreams, with fire, with fantasies too wild for her carefully controlled public life. And as she names them now, not with scandal but with warmth, she invites the world to see her not as a porcelain doll, but as a woman who once yearned, and still remembers every detail. For over half a century, Julie Andrews was the embodiment of restraint, elegance, and quiet perfection. A woman who made the world feel safe. Her voice was a lullaby for generations, her characters models of virtue. But now, at 90, with the world far removed from the age of golden studios and press-controlled interviews, she is rewriting her narrative, not with scandal, but with truth. By naming the 7 men she secretly desired, by finally revealing the passion she buried under the layers of grace, Julie has pulled back the curtain not just on herself, but on what it truly meant to be a woman in Hollywood's most suffocating era. Her confession is not about sex, not really. It's about permission. It's about how she spent decades being everything for everyone, an icon, a role model, a voice of purity, while carrying her own human longing in silence. That silence, in many ways, was expected of her. The industry rewarded women who were flawless on camera and invisible off it. Desire wasn't something Julie was allowed to express. It had to be danced around, hinted at, sanitized into fairy tales. And yet, it was always there. Now, as she reflects on a life lived in the public eye, she does so with the clarity that only age and immense self-awareness can bring. She isn't naming these men for attention. She's not chasing headlines or breaking rules. She's simply telling the truth. And in doing so, she's reclaiming the parts of herself that were once hidden for the sake of an image. The beauty of Julie Andrews's confession lies not in the names she chose, but in the fact that she's choosing herself, choosing to say, yes, I wanted, I imagined, I felt. For a woman who spent a lifetime being seen as pristine, this act of emotional honesty is perhaps the boldest thing she's ever done. It reminds us that even the most polished stars have inner worlds far messier, far more fascinating than we ever knew. Her legacy, once etched in musical notes and classic lines, now holds something deeper: vulnerability, humanity. A reminder that icons are not immune to desire, and that age doesn't erase longing, it only frees it. For Julie, naming the 7 men wasn't about conquest or regret. It was about memory, about giving herself permission to laugh, to blush, to relive the sweetness of what never was. And perhaps, in some poetic way, it was her way of dancing one last time, not across the Alps, but through the memories of the men who stirred her soul. She didn't need them to complete her. She didn't need to act on the feelings. But in naming them now, she's proved that a woman's inner life is never simple, never linear, and never fully visible from the outside. So when the world looks back at Julie Andrews, it will still see the brilliance, the music, the legacy. But now it will also see the woman behind it all. A woman who once whispered her fantasies into the silence, and finally, after 9 decades, decided to speak them out loud. Not for applause, not for approval, but because even the most graceful legends deserve to tell the full story of who they really were. And Julie Andrews, with all her dignity, wit, and quiet fire, has just told hers.